Hello, everyone. Welcome to Black Minds Matter. My name is Luke Wood, and I serve as the professor for this course alongside my colleague and good friend, Dr. Donna Y Ford. We're very grateful that you're here today, and we have some wonderful guest speakers who are going to shed light on issues facing Black students in education. But before we begin, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of North America, whose unceded, traditional, and contemporary lands this virtual convening is taking place. We acknowledge the ancestral spirits of these lands with the utmost gratitude and respect. As we move forward, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is what will be the headline of tomorrow. The headline of tomorrow will say that this is the lowest Black suspension rates in the history of education. In the history of education, or at least since the data have been collected. For many years, educational advocates have fought to reduce school suspensions through research, policy work, and advocacy designed to change people and systems. But these factors were irrelevant to society achieving this somewhat heartbreaking milestone. It wasn't that researchers finally demonstrated enough that Black people experience disproportionate discipline, such as referrals, suspensions, or expulsions, or because they were finally able to convince the masses that implicit bias and microaggressions are real daily experiences. It wasn't because the policy advocates finally found the magic formula to ensure that policies are designed in a manner where they actually curb school suspensions, or that their implementation efforts finally succeeded in ensuring helpful policies were implemented in a way that was actually helpful. And it wasn't because the advocates on the ground finally found a way to hold local and state policymakers accountable for the lack of oversight, accountability, or transparency. In fact, it was for none of these reasons at all. It was because COVID-19 removed Black children from physical environments so their bodies were not present to be targeted by educators, to be suspected of being a troublemaker, to be hyper-surveilled for wrongdoing, to be singled out for punishment, and to be subjected to longer and harsher discipline. To all those who ardently fought against school suspensions, we finally did it. We finally succeeded. We finally hit the mark, but not for any good reason at all. So let's begin by talking about pressures facing students. We know that as our students return, our Black students are going to be facing innumerable pressures, as are the educators who will be working with them. There'll be challenges around basic needs insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity. These will be real concerns that our students are facing, especially in light of a global pandemic that has caused an economic recession that has made hard living even harder for some. There'll be challenges in access to school and campus resources and staff because students can't physically access those spaces, and neither can their parents. There'll be challenges of balancing the demands of home and school, trying to be in an environment and learn while other people are on the internet or in the same space, in the same area, talking, working alongside another student. There's going to be the challenges around the loss of employment, a parent who simply doesn't have a job, or a high schooler who was working to provide for their family is no longer able to do so, or by now doing so puts them at risk, a higher risk of COVID-19. And this brings us to COVID-19. As Gloria Ladson-Billings said, there's going to be an emotional toll in terms of the sickness and death that students have faced and experienced, not to mention the racial challenges that they have seen in the murder of George Floyd. We also know that some Black students will miss out on the pod. Pods are small groups and collections of parents who bring together their children to provide them with additional learning opportunities. Oftentimes, they'll bring in a teacher or someone else who has the same level of proficiency to work with their students in small groups over the summer and during the fall. We will find that many of our Black students do not have access to these pods, while many of these pods will be restricted to our more white and affluent brothers and sisters. Ultimately, there will be challenge access and proficiency. Having Wi-Fi, having a computer, these are basics. There'll also be the online fatigue of being on Zoom or Skype or whatever platform you're using. Most people at this point are a little bit tired of being on the same platform over and over again. All these pressures are going to face our students, but these pressures are also going to face many of our faculty and staff as well. Earlier this summer, my colleague Frank Harris and I held a webinar focused on what does online learning look like in the digital environment, in the online environment. And we talked about a concept of digital equity, and I'd like to read you an excerpt from that. Ensuring that all students, regardless of their identities or circumstances, can participate in the virtual learning space in ways that will be value added to achieving their personal and academic goals. That's our aim. Special attention must be given to digital equity, in that students must have access to the technology and technological knowledge they need to seamlessly access and make meaningful contributions to the virtual learning space. We also know that there will be challenges in terms of perceptions from educators. There will be students who don't log in on time, or their internet isn't working, or they don't complete an assignment, or they turn an assignment late, or they don't know how to use the technology. They don't know how to turn their camera on or turn their camera off. They may have parents who are unresponsive or not immediately responsive, and there could be challenges with language barriers between parents and teachers. But none of these are necessarily challenges that rely on or sit with students, their families, and their communities. These are challenges that we all have to think about, how do we work around, because COVID-19 has adversely impacted communities of color. The economic downturn has adversely impacted communities of color. The stress of racial strife has adversely impacted communities. We don't want to hear people say the child doesn't care about school, or that the parent isn't committed to their child's success, or that the parent isn't engaged in their child's education. Ultimately, it's not a function of the students, their families, and their communities. There are larger social issues at play, but ultimately, as educators, we don't look at that. What we look at is what is within our control. And from an equity-minded perspective, we say, what are we doing or not doing that's resulting in the breakdowns that we see? And from that standpoint and that onus of control and responsibility, we are able to make the changes that are necessary. We also have to recognize that exclusionary discipline is at play within the Black community currently. And it refers to and encompasses any type of school disciplinary action that removes or excludes a student from his or her or their educational setting. And this is according to the American Psychological Association. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see three common ways in which this plays out: referrals, suspensions, and expulsions. But there's other types, right? You can be excluded from extracurricular activities. You can have a referral to a school official, an in-school suspension, an out-of-school suspension, referrals to law enforcement, expulsions. There are also other ways in which this plays out, both not necessarily direct instruction time, but the holistic learning and development time that students have on the yard with other children. The loss of recess, detention during lunch, or silent lunch can also exclude a child from a very critical learning environment. While these represent the most common forms of exclusionary discipline, there are other forms of discipline that face our Black children. It can be a detention after school, an involuntary transfer, a Saturday school, a warning, a reflection activity, or a student conference or parent-student conference. There are other ways in which we see these patterns play out as well. In our work, we've looked at this in a number of different reports. Get Out with our colleagues Tyrone Howard and Frank Harris III, and most recently with the new report, When They Teach Us, the education of Black children in San Diego, that was released along with my colleagues Michelle DeJeanette, Frank Harris III, Muhammad Abdi, and Idara Essien. And in this report that focuses on San Diego, there are some things that we have learned that we think are applicable and useful for people to learn about across the nation. First, what we found in the report is that there are some schools that have exorbitantly high annual suspension rates, unduplicated suspensions. That refers to a student who is suspended at least one time in the academic year. Now, that doesn't include a student who's suspended multiple times, because you can have multiple suspensions in 1 year, or a student who's suspended in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. It only looks at the annual suspension rate. In the district that we're looking at here, which is San Diego Unified, the district suspension rate was 3.5%. But at some schools, as you can see in this chart, suspension rates range from 20% to upwards of 52.4%. And on the slide, you can see schools in our local locale that have struggled with these challenges. And in many ways, when we look at the data disaggregated by gender, we also see that many of these schools are also suspending Black girls at high rates as well. But one of the things that we learned from the report that was so important was this. A lot of the suspensions that we see taking place don't take place in urban areas. They really take place in rural areas. The higher suspension rates oftentimes are in places where Black people are underrepresented and isolated from an infrastructure of accountability. We also see when it comes to suspensions that when people think about disparities, yes, the highest suspensions are in middle school, but the disparity between Black children and white children, or Black children and other children, is not in middle school. It's not in high school, middle school, or latter elementary. It's in early childhood education, the formative years of schooling that children are going through. One of the other really critical things that we learned from the report is this, that there are many of these schools that you see listed here that are also what are considered to be great schools by greatschools.org. In fact, what we've done on the right-hand side, you can see those stars under Fletcher Elementary, Marshall Middle, Longfellow K-8, right, and other schools. But what we've done is we've identified any school with a score of 7 or higher on the greatschools.org website. And what we've learned is this. Many of the schools that have high suspension rates are also considered schools that are great schools. So what we know is this: just because it's a great school for students in general doesn't mean it's a great school for Black children. When we look to criminalization, we have to recognize where our nation stands. This is data from the Sentencing Project, and what you'll see here is international rates of incarceration per 100,000 people. And you'll see that the United States has the highest incarceration rate, followed by El Salvador, Rwanda, and Russia. And then you can see precipitous declines from there. In addition, we also have seen that the prison population has exploded, particularly beginning around the 1980s up through the 90s and 2000s. What we can see is that there is a high number of people who are being incarcerated in the United States, but it's not all people. We also know that it is adversely impacting our Black communities. In fact, research has shown that 1 in every 3 Black persons born today, Black men, will experience prison at some point in their lifetime. In fact, on the left-hand side, the sentencing project says that Black youth were more than 5 times as likely to be detained or committed compared to white youth. These are real challenges. We see this as what it takes place in terms of policing and Black lives, but we also see these same challenges in terms of Black minds. In Black minds, we see that suspensions are high, even in preschool. On this chart, you can see from data from the U.S. Office of Civil Rights that there is 18% enrollment of Black children in preschool, yet they account for 42% of out-of-school suspensions. I want you to take a moment and think about that. Black children account for only 18% of children in preschool, but 42% of the out-of-school suspensions. But it doesn't stop there. It continues on through the rest of elementary school, middle school, and high school, with high rates of overrepresentation in in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, multiple out-of-school suspensions, and ultimately expulsions as well. One of the things that we want to keep in mind is this. As we transition into our new environment of COVID-19 with the fall semester, where we will be virtual, online in many places, that the issues of exclusionary discipline that we've talked about will often be masked. They will be masked by a lack of data. And if they are accounted for, they will be accounted for often as absenteeisms. There are other ways that we have to be vigilant in terms of paying attention to the patterns that are facing our Black students. When they are trying to enter in a learning environment, are they eliminated access to the course link so that they have the right link to go on to? Are they provided that in a timely manner? When they go into the waiting room in a virtual setting, are they admitted from the waiting room into the real room? Are they removed from a video conference room because they are perceived as being disruptive? Or is their camera turned off? Or is their name changed? Or is their microphone turned off? These are real issues that we have to pay attention to, because these are real issues and challenges that will be facing our Black students when they come back this fall. With that, I'd like to begin by introducing our guest speakers for today. Our first guest speaker is Lasana Hotep, who is an anti-racist and anti-sexist educator, strategic thought partner, and transformative executive coach with a commitment to dismantling institutional inequities and creating transformative solutions for people and organizations. For over 20 years, Lasana served as a P-12 community college and university levels as a classroom teacher, racial justice advocate, and equity advancing administrator. Currently, Lasana serves as the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the University of California at Berkeley. Beyond this, he's a personal friend, a mentor, a colleague, and definitely someone who you want to hear from today. In addition, I'd like to introduce the great Chance Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the Carol Gross Belk Distinguished Professor of Urban Education at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he also serves as the Director for Urban Education Collaborative. He leads the urban concentration of the Ph.D. in curriculum and instruction. Dr. Lewis's special areas of interest are academic achievement of students of color in K-12 settings, recruitment and retention of Black male teachers in urban education, and other topics that focus on Black students. Dr. Lewis has over 100 refereed publications and over 6 million in external research funding. And lastly, but not least, we'd like to introduce Dr. Andre Perry. Dr. Andre Perry is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. He is a scholar in residence at American University and a columnist for Hechinger Report. He is the author of the new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, which is currently available wherever books are sold. We definitely encourage you to reach out and get a copy. It's called Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. I'd also like to say that Perry is a nationally known and respected commentator on race, structural inequity, and education, and he continues to contribute regularly to media outlets. Welcome to Black Minds Matter. Let's go ahead and jump in with our guest speakers for the day. All right, everyone, we are very excited today to have the great Lasana Hotep with us. Brother Hotep is at University of California at Berkeley and has been an expert in Black issues and education, anti-Blackness, anti-racism work. And both Donna and I were very pleased to be able to have him join Black Minds Matter. So welcome, Lasana.
Getting the invitation to participate in Black Minds Matters really caused me to do some reflection on connecting the major themes, which is Black lives and Black minds. And having a background rooted in history, and particularly history of people of African descent, I wanted to kind of give that perspective. I'm not sure if any of my other colleagues in the course are going to give a historical perspective. So I wanted to give a historical perspective, question some assumptions, and then kind of offer a way forward real briefly. So the first thing I want to talk about, when you start talking about Black lives and Black minds, one of the things that's really not addressed is the fact of the intersection of legality and Black people actually learning. Like that is actually a lived reality of people of African ancestry in the United States of America. So right here, I'm just showing you a newspaper clipping that talks about the laws that kept Black people from learning. In Virginia, should free Negroes or their children assemble at a school to learn reading or writing, any justice of the peace may dismiss the school with 20 stripes on the back of every pupil. In Louisiana, the penalty for instructing a free Black in Sunday school is for the first offense, $500, for the second offense, death. So we first must understand that there's always been this connection between the criminality of Black people, the perceived and shaped and contextualized and created criminality of Black people, and learning. If you go further into the understanding in the histories, you'll see that there was always a connection between literacy and keeping Black people from learning and expressing themselves fully as human beings. In Self-Taught, it says literacy had the potential to help enslaved people articulate intellectual objections to the very existence of the institution of slavery. And so when you go from the antebellum period where African people were enslaved and held captive as chattel, and this strong emphasis on keeping Black people from being a learned people, you see it play itself out even in the removal of the institution of enslavement and going into other areas. But there's still this consistent, deliberate attempt to deny Black people a thorough education. In Ira Katznelson's When Affirmative Action Was White, he cites this through the way in which schools were funded by all of these mechanisms of federal dollars that are supposed to go evenly and be dispersed evenly through the states. He shows through the data that there had been a disparate distribution and allocation of funding. He says in the 31 states that did not maintain separate schools for Black and white children, the median classroom receives just over $2,100 each school year. Some 1.56 million children were schooled in classrooms whose budget was less than $600. Of these, fully 80% were Black. He continues, and he just says it in a different way. He says, measured differently, the value of school plant equipment for each Southern white child in 1940 was $162, for each Black, $34. So you even see outside of enslavement, even with federal action being taken, there's been this consistent gap in how Black people have been engaged in the institutions that were responsible for educating us, and even in the funding, even in the pedagogy, even in the teaching. So even if you look at these famous civil rights moments where you see Elizabeth Eckford in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas, one of the Little Rock Nine, look at this environment in which she's going into school. This is her not trying to overthrow the government. This is her not trying to be an agitator in any type of way of disrupting any law or the Constitution of the United States of America. But as you can see, the visceral reaction that she received, as well as her peers, from simply just going to school, and the act itself brings out this kind of animosity to where the federal government had to send in the 101st Airborne. You see it also in Ruby Bridges in 1960 in New Orleans, Louisiana, where you see Black people, just the act of going to school, getting educated, requires extreme circumstances and extreme protection because of this act. And this is important to understand when we start talking about equality and equity, because as you can see, these young ladies could not have went to school normally. They needed the 101st Airborne. They needed U.S. Marshals. It had to be an extreme act to disrupt the status quo. And that's the same thing that's needed for contemporary times, an extreme act to disrupt the status quo. But those of us who are in the West and those of us who are in the Northeast don't feel like we had it any better. This is a very popular photo of Ted Landsmark, who was an attorney who was walking to the courtroom to handle his daily business when he stumbled upon, in Boston, Massachusetts, an anti-busing rally. So it's not just Arkansas, it's not just Louisiana, it's not just Texas. This is Boston, Massachusetts, where a black lawyer was grabbed, held captive, and then speared with a pole bearing the American flag. This famous Pulitzer Prize-winning photo is called "The Soiling of Old Glory." And so here again, this is an anti-busing rally. Again, education of black people in the extreme resistance that has taken place. And it's always been a tension there, from enslavement all the way up to the so-called busing movement. And so we have to understand this context. We can't just look at the issues that we're having in terms of anti-blackness in education, the disregarding of black lives and black minds, without understanding that this is part of a long trajectory and a long timeline that we're just in one particular moment of. And so the thing I want to do now, after just giving that very short historical snapshot, is to deal with some of the assumptions that we have around addressing anti-blackness in education. So I'm only going to deal with a couple of assumptions. I have a myriad of them that I will be dealing with in a course that I'll be developing for Cora at a later date, but I'm just going to deal with a couple of them now. The first one is that anti-black racism exists because of ignorance and hatred. The reason why I want to address these assumptions is because we really develop our interventions, develop our programs, develop our responses based on the assumptions that we make. And so I want to clarify these assumptions. And the first thing I have to clear is that anti-black racism does not exist because of ignorance and hatred. And we know this because Ibram Kendi, the author of Stamped from the Beginning, gives us the history of racist ideas. That's the name of the book, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And he says, time and again, racist ideas have not been cooked up from the boiling pot of ignorance and hate. He explicitly says that. Time and again, powerful and brilliant men and women have produced racist ideas in order to justify the racist policies of their era, in order to redirect the blame for the era's racial disparities away from those policies and onto black people. And that speaks to what I was showing you about the disparate funding and the gap in funding in the 1940s, is that the policy and the way in which funding was allocated was really the true problem. But narratives were created about blacks' abilities to learn and blacks' inability to have cognitive skills, to rationalize the disparities that we see in education. And so it's very important that we get an understanding that racial animus is not because of ignorance and hatred, but it's racial animus exists because people have this perception that there's a zero-sum game when it comes to resources, and narratives are created that means that black people should not have certain experiences or certain resources. So we're going to watch a really brief clip that was shot after the murder of 9 parishioners in South Carolina. This is featuring Dr. Jelani Cobb, who's speaking to the reason why we have racial animus and the challenges that we're facing in contemporary times when we're interpreting the racial climate that we're in.
Jelani Cobb is a University of Connecticut history professor and also a prolific writer for the New Yorker magazine. And as you've listened to this unfold, what have you heard left unsaid?
First, I would say that it's very difficult to continually have this conversation. That we saw this conversation after Baltimore. We saw this conversation after Ferguson. We're having this conversation now, and no doubt there'll be some occasion for us to have this conversation again in the future.
Which breaks my heart.
It does. And I think that, with no ill intent, we've greatly overestimated 2 things. 1, the power of conversation, and 2, the extent of the benevolence of white people in America.
What do you mean?
And what I mean by that is this, that there are studies that show that more than half of white people in this country feel that they are the primary victims of racism. And that having a dialogue, slavery did not begin because of miscommunication. Jim Crow did not happen. Jim Crow did not happen because people somehow couldn't get on the same page. that these were systems that were designed to exploit one group of people to the benefit of another group of people. And unless we're willing to talk about this, these connections between what Dylann Roof saw as himself as a part of an aggrieved group of people who were besieged by black people, which is the same thinking that animated the violent attacks on black people in this state after Reconstruction. The white belief that black people had something that they were not entitled to, that somehow or another that they were losing out, that the currency of whiteness had been devalued. And this is what we're talking about here. And so it is about interests. It is about who has resources. It is about who has excess resources. It is about who is willing to part with those resources.
And so Dr. Cobb made it plain in that article, in that interview. They talked about him being at the University of Connecticut, but now he's at Columbia University. The second assumption I want to address when it comes to anti-blackness is being a good or nice person provides immunity from anti-blackness. And so when we go back to when I was talking about the depictions during the integrationist movement post-Brown versus Board of Education, many of us look at this in contemporary time to say that wouldn't be me, right? I wouldn't be that person. Now, that's understandable. A lot of us, our colleagues, our peers, allies, people who are in solidarity, co-conspirators, really do not see themselves in this particular light, right? But what we have to understand is that if we are interested in maintaining the status quo, and we're not actively doing something to disrupt that, we may not be like these individuals in this picture that I have on the screen now, but we're not going to disrupt the status quo. And the status quo produces the disparate outcomes, the gaps, and the inequities, and even the racial injustice that we see today. And so Robin DiAngelo, who has gotten a significant amount of attention in this anti-racism conversation, talks about this and this whole notion of just being nice and what impact it could have on communities who are oppressed.
Into the status quo. For so many white people, we think that the answer to racism is friendliness. If you notice the evidence that most white people will give for why they're not racist, one of their top pieces of evidence is, I know people of color. I have friends of color. And so if we apply that question, if we look at that evidence as a way to understand the deeper structure of meaning, right, it's actually quite revealing. So in order for a claim like that, I know people of color, I have friends of color, in order for a claim like that to be good evidence of my lack of racism, a racist can't be able to do that. Otherwise, it's not good evidence. Right? This is what distinguishes me from a racist. I have people of color in my life. I live in New York City. I was in Teach for America. I went to a diverse school. These are all the claims that white people will make for their lack of racism. Well, that must mean a racist cannot live in New York City, could not know or speak to or be friendly to people of color, could not be in the Peace Corps, etc. And I'm hoping you can see right now how ridiculous that evidence is, because even an avowed racist can do all of those things. So most white people believe that niceness is all it takes. And the status quo of our society is the reproduction of racial inequality. That's what it does. It's a default of all of our institutions, our norms, and our policies. It's what our society does. It's what it's always done. Our outcomes are not improving. By many measures, our outcomes of racial disparity are increasing. Right? And all this system needs to keep on keeping on reproducing racial inequality with whites benefiting from it is for white people just to be really nice. Be really nice. Go ahead. Smile at your coworkers of color, go to lunch on occasion, and do nothing else. And you will uphold that system, because niceness is not courageous. Niceness is not anti-racism. Niceness will not get racism on the table, and it will not keep it on the table when everyone wants it off the table. I suppose it's better than not being nice. But it takes strategic, intentional anti-racist action. It is a lifelong process that I will never be finished from. The mainstream definition of a racist.
So taking our understanding of what Robin talking about is that being nice or just allowing the status quo to exist as it does is not going to change the climate that we have in terms of racial injustice, in terms of what our children are experiencing and what we're experiencing as faculty, staff, and administrators who are of African descent in education, is that we have to be disruptive. We cannot maintain the status quo. And so when you look at these calls in contemporary times for things like defund the police and end white silence, right? When you see these types of statements, people express them as being extremists, but no one express it being an extreme that on consistent basis, we have videotape footage of unarmed citizens being murdered by trained police officers. How is that not extreme? How is that normalized? Okay. And so when we talk about Black minds and Black lives, there's clearly a braided connection between the two. And so the reason why I'm showing this slide is because when it says defund the police, invest in the Black community, these types of arguments make their way also in the arguments we're making for education. Our organizations have to do equity audits. They have to look at the organizational structure. So many times when I talk to people in education, they're so busy trying to preserve the current structure and not disrupt the various stakeholders who have planted their flags and created their fiefdoms in certain parts within the organization, that it's very difficult to get any different kinds of outcomes because they're so wedded. Their first thing when they're talking to me is about how do they maintain the exact same structure but get different results. That's a virtual impossibility. The next thing is budget. A budget is a moral document. When we're looking at your budget, if we don't see a disruptive reallocation of funds to support the most disproportionately impacted groups. And I'm not just talking about in California community college speak, we have something called categorical funds, but I'm talking about your main budget. What is your main budget say about you being disruptive in addressing those gaps? The other thing is the evaluation process. How many people, administrators, faculty, staff within the organization have the elimination of gaps, have the closing of all of these different types of disparities within the context of their evaluation, because people do what is either going to get them to be compliant or what they're evaluated on. And lastly, our policies. Many, if not all of our policies are neutral at face value, but they produce disparate outcomes. So we need a disruptive response. And so as I get ready to wrap, I want to tie this all together. I talked about literacy at the beginning and the anti-literacy laws that existed to keep Black people from learning. And you see that connection between literacy and learning and incarceration directly. 85% of juveniles who interface with the juvenile court system are functionally low literate. Juvenile incarceration reduces the probability of high school completion and increases the probability of incarceration in life. High school, people who leave high school are 3.5 times more likely than high school graduates to be arrested in their lifetime. People who leave high school are 63% more likely to be incarcerated than their peers. And then it has a specific data about Mississippi, the second highest incarceration rate in the nation. The average adult inmate reads on a 6th grade level when admitted. Half of the state's inmate never finished high school. So this is the data that shows the direct connection between Black lives and Black minds. And so I want to conclude with this particular quote from How to Be an Anti-Racist. Changing minds is not a movement. Critiquing racism is not activism. An activist produces power and policy change, not mental change. If a person has no record of power or policy change, then that person is not an activist. So those of us who are going through this wonderful course that's being facilitated by Doctors Wood and Ford, it's important that we start to begin to focus our work on where we can find tangible power and policy change in our efforts to love, support, and nourish the Black mind.
Can you dig deeper into the difference for you between equity and equality?
Thank you, Dr. Ford, for posing that question. So one of the simple ways in which I explain equity to folks in the difference between equity and equality is something that I call potty parity. And so if you were to go and think about a time where we were at a large public event and you had to go to the restroom and there was a very long line for the restroom labeled women, and then there is not even a line for the restroom labeled men, that is equality. There's one restroom for each population. That's equality. Even though one group is disparately impacted and have to wait in a long line, right, and their bladder has to suffer unnecessarily, that is equality. Now, what we're doing in terms of looking at student populations, instead of looking at the structure, wow, this one-to-one thing is producing disparate outcomes, what we'll do is we'll say, why does it take women so long to use the restroom? And can we find some women who can use the restroom faster? And then what we need to do is study them, write master's theses, write doctoral dissertations, take them to conferences, sit them on panels, and have them shame the other women who aren't using the restroom as fast, which is causing the line, right? When we all know that the problem is not with women, it's the structure in and of itself. So one of the issues we have is the fact that we are trying to pose or position equality as equity. Now, this is what happens. If someone was to say, you know what, we need a few more non-gender binary restrooms, plus we may need another one labeled women, the people who are under the group that's categorized as men, what they'll say is that's not fair. Even if they don't need another restroom, they're having no problems. One of the biggest things you hear from them is that it is not fair. And this is why we can't have equity, because when we show our organizational data and we show that groups are disproportionately impacted, and we say that we need both human and fiscal resources allocated to close these gaps, there's constituencies on our campus that have planted their flag in the ground that say that we should get it too, even if they don't need it. And so that's why I was so adamant in emphasizing the fact that they use marshals and they use military troops, federal military troops, is because that had to be an extreme to deal with a social problem. And we need to go to an extreme. Right now, what we're doing is we're saying, oh, men of color are having an issue within our colleges. Let's give a person a half, either a part-time assignment or 0.2 or 0.4 assignment, give them some money for pizza and some t-shirts, and they should be able to close the gap. No. You actually need to go the other way. You might need to say, we need 4 different full-time people on this, and we need a budget with tens of thousands of dollars because there is a gap. And so the difference between equality and equity is simply this. Equality is giving everybody the same thing and expecting different outcomes, even though people have different starting places and different access to resources. And equity is taking in consideration the structure and institutional barriers that are creating the disparate outcomes.
I just have one last comment.
Okay.
I believe that it's just as bad when we, Black people, become successful, drive a nice car, live in a, whatever that means, let's say expensive car, live in a suburban community, et cetera. It still happens to us because we're not supposed to damn be there.
And so when Black people of means are harassed by police, it's not because of the poverty piece or the socioeconomic piece you're talking about. It's an attempt to remind you that there is a place for people like you. And I'm going to remind you that even though you may have economically broke through certain barriers, there's still a place for you. And that's what Jelani Cobb was talking about in the video that I showed earlier, is this notion that Black people are having something that they should not have simply because they are Black. And so this plays itself out in these assumptions that we have, this plays itself out in the classrooms, connecting it back to Black minds, is that there is no sense of urgency. There is no sense of what is it that I can do, or it's keeping me up at night, by a lot of people who are in education who are seeing the disparate impact on people of African ancestry in public institutions and private institutions. There is no really sense of urgency because they already believe in their mind that they're performing at the level that's appropriate for their people in their place. And that's why I connected everything from the literacy to the integration to contemporary times, is that there is a fundamental attempt to keep the status quo and to normalize the underperformance of people of African ancestry, and to treat, and to your point being gifted and talented, to treat those who go beyond that as some kind of rare unicorn exception. And so Tim Wise has this thing called enlightened exceptionalism. And when he says that enlightened exceptionalism is that where a white person can have high regard for a Barack Obama, a Oprah Winfrey, a LeBron James, but still hold the greater vast majority of Black people in contempt, right? Because you have this thing and this notion that you heard called they transcended Blackness. Right. Well, they're not Black anymore. They're more than Black. But no one ever has to transcend whiteness. Right? No one ever has to transcend whiteness. Whiteness has never had to be transcended. Because, again, that's a hierarchical. That is a framing of the limitations of what it means to be Black based on the structures, institutions, and the attitudes that have been developed by the society. So in closing, I'll just say that we have to understand that it's never really the thing. It's not because you have money or you don't have money, right? It's not because you either are sagging pants or not sagging pants. Martin Luther King was assassinated wearing a suit and tie, right? It's because of this narrative that's been created around what Blackness is, what Blackness is capable of, and what Blackness should be doing, and us having to negotiate and navigate the various responses to that.
With that, Lasana, we just want to thank you for joining us and for being part of this experience, Black Minds Matter.
I'm honored. This is a wonderful, important opportunity for all of us to engage within education and within the broader society. And I salute you, I salute Dr. Ford, and I salute everyone who's participating in this work. And I'm looking forward to us continuing to build on this work.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, we are very fortunate to have our next guest, Chance Lewis, who is a professor at UNC Charlotte, operates an incredible center out there, is a distinguished scholar in the field of education, and is particularly an expert when it comes to Black student success. So thank you, Dr. Lewis, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
So I wanted to kind of jump right in, focusing on the parallels between what we see in Black lives and what we see in Black minds. So would love to know, what are you seeing in your work as it relates to this?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we see this undervaluing and this overcriminalization, on a daily basis in schools. And here are some ways this plays out in schools on a daily basis. In the undervaluing, let's just start for a minute how students get to school. You think about, for many Black and brown students, but particularly Black students, many of them have to travel great distances to get to school. So if they're riding on a school bus, the undervaluing of these students make them ride long distances where they may be on a bus an hour or two before school starts. And they may even have to transfer from one bus to another bus just to get to school. And if, we were to value, these particular students, there would be no way this would happen in other racial groups. But even when they get to the door of the school, many Black students are then met with metal detectors, at the front door of the school. So what you're putting in their mindset right at the door of the building is that we have to expose you to a criminalization kind of mindset of we need to check you before you go into the school, even though, the data shows most, shootings and all of that, occur at predominantly white schools, as well. But another factor that we see in the undervaluing and overcriminalization is really looking at the school resource officers that are in school, because they are being asked to do things that they're not even trained to do. For example, they're asked to play a big part in classroom management issues, which is not what they're trained to do. They're trained to arrest people, and they're trained, more legal matters, not classroom management. So when we think about things like that, those kind of nuances, once you have a legal authority inside of a classroom, assisting with classroom management, now you have a situation where something is bound to happen to really negatively impact Black students. Some other things that kind of play out on a daily basis in schools, and we see all the time, I'm sure you see it in your work, is this notion of in-school suspensions. And in-school suspensions, I really call it in the thousands of schools that I've been in across the country, I call it really in-school incarceration. From the standpoint, it's just mainly a holding area where educators send students, maybe the infraction was not big enough for them to suspend them out of school, so they just send them to this holding area. And I think, as we start to see how many students, Black students, lose instructional time, it is really, mind-boggling. And, and these are just a few examples. I have some more here, but these are just a few examples of what we're talking about on a daily basis of how undervaluing and overcriminalization just started to happen with just our daily practice in the schools.
So what are some of the things that need to change for that pattern to be different?
Yes.
So it manifests in numerous ways. So what do we do about it?
Yeah. Let's talk through that. From my work and research and practice in schools, first thing that has to happen really before we get into any recommendations is that the schools and school districts first have to make Black students a priority, because when they're not a priority for the school or for the school district, you have all these ripple effects that happen. And when I mean a priority in the school, where we're going to dedicate the resources that we have to make sure these students are successful academically. We provide them with all the support and resources that they need to do that. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. If Black students were a priority inside of these schools, we would not see school counselor caseloads like we do. One counselor for every 500-600 students. We wouldn't see the social worker load, the way it is. So these are just a few examples of what I'm talking about as well. But after we make these students a priority in the school, then we could start to do some other things in the school that are innovative. For example, I write in some of my books where schools can transform spaces inside of the school for what I call engagement centers, because inside of every school in the country, they have what I call unused or dead spaces. These are just spaces in the building. It could be an old room where they just put storage stuff in, it could be an old closet. And, if we looked at all the unused spaces in the building, we can really transform those spaces for Black students to become what I call engagement centers, where they can be engaged around interest areas. So when we look at those particular interest areas and those skills and talents that Black students bring to the school, what if we had engagement clubs, around these talents that they bring? So you may have a group of Black students that enjoy video games. So, a lot of educators educators look at that as a negative. But what if we had a video game kind of club at the school, and then, we could have students design video games, bring in their academic learning, into that particular situation, mathematics, science, where they build games and, embracing the talents that they have as well. So as we look at these spaces that are unused in the building, this could be a prime opportunity for Black students to get engaged in a whole new way that is innovative, for schooling as well. And just a couple of other ones, just based on your question, is that I also believe for these students to reach their full potential, there needs to be intentional professional development on working specifically with Black students. Because when we look at professional development that goes on in the building, many school administrators look at it in more of a general way. So we're going to look at it to improve reading or, improve mathematics, but I'm talking about specifically training on Black students, what works, for the majority of Black students, how do we engage them in these particular subjects, what are some teaching strategies, around those particular subjects, how do we, bring in, as Gloria Ladson-Billings, right, their culture into the classroom and make it meaningful for students. Because as we look at this, one thing we find, and the reason why Ph.D. is so important, is that in teacher preparation programs, many of these candidates are not trained on specifically how to work with Black students. So when they're hired, they don't magically know how to work with Black students. All they know is what they've seen on TV and any stereotypical things that they bring to the classroom. So now you are putting their minds, the Black students' minds, in the hands of educators who have not been trained on specifically how to work with them in the classroom, which leads to a disastrous situation in the classroom as well.
I will often go and see professional learning that's taking place in a district, and they got their 1-time 2-hour training on Black students, and they're good, right? Is that all they need?
Right. Oh, no, it's much more than that. So, because usually a lot of times when they do trainings like that, the teachers have checked out, anyway, so they're not paying attention. Where at the heart of your question, where it really needs to happen in what they call in schools PLCs, professional learning communities, because this is where pretty much on a weekly basis, teams of teachers meet together for academic planning. Okay. And so it may be a 4th grade team working together, or it may be a mathematics content area team. And so inside of those teams, they do professional development with academic coaches that are in the building, or academic coaches from the district. And so this is where that rubber meets the road, where they are actually planning lessons, doing mock teaching, doing assessments, how we're going to assess the students, really going through what works, actually aligning curriculum where each teacher, let's just say in the 4th grade example, they're going to be working on a similar pacing for different 4th grade classes. But that's where we can get the most impact, because it allows time for those teachers to say, hey, when we look across the demographic of our students, we see we have these Black students in our classroom. What are the ways that we're going to implement instructional strategies to meet the needs of those Black students as well? So that's the point, what I'm talking about with professional development, not that general professional development before the school year starts and then you forget about it by the first day of school.
Got it. So it's got to be intensive, ongoing, and be unapologetic in having a specific focus on Black students and their needs.
Exactly. And if not, we've lost the race, because a lot of times I get called in to work in these professional learning communities, but usually when they call me is after the fact of a couple of grading periods have gone forward in the school year, and now they want somebody to come in and try to save the day when grades are not, how they are, or, teachers are not relating well with students as well, but it should start right from the beginning as well. That's a solid recommendation that I would want all educators who are watching to be able to implement.
So let's switch topics just a little bit here and talk a bit about the school to prison pipeline, which generally refers to the way that schools socialize certain students towards the criminal justice system. So I'm wondering about, in context of school to prison pipeline, what do you think about those as being the two general undergirding patterns, undervaluing and overcriminalization? And what do you believe we should be doing about it?
Yeah, so great question. So look at the school to prison pipeline. Many people talk about kind of the big ticket items that I would call it, look at discipline and those things that happen there and some things mentioned. So let me give you a few other things that are going on in the school and how we can solve it to kind of curb this. So in classrooms around the country, in my opinion, one piece that adds to this school to prison pipeline is what I call the isolation of Black students in the classroom. And here's what I mean by that, is that oftentimes when I visit a school, pretty much over 80, 90% of the time, I'll walk in a classroom and I'll see students doing their work, but there are a couple of Black students in the back corner of a classroom, by themselves, not working on academic material. I asked the teacher, why is the student there? They're back there, getting refocused, right? So now they pull them out of the classroom situation. Now they're isolated. Okay, in front of their
classroom.
Within the classroom. Okay, so this is before the in-school suspension. Okay, so now they're in the back corner, and so now when you really looking at that, they're kind of in a holding cell in the room. Okay, and then as you look at that, now that all of their peers, see them, and what happens is that since these teachers are saying, they're there to cool down or whatever the situation is, this is a portion where it has already signaled to the student that, we're going to have you excluded from the rest of your peers. Okay, and then as we look at this further, if you move this forward to a policy level higher, okay, how the school and school district discipline policy is written towards criminalization, okay? So when we think about discipline in school, it's not to be punitive in its foundation. It's more about guidance to get them back to the academic learning, right? But we've taken the reverse of that to exclude them from the academic learning, okay? So when we think about it, all resources should be focused on getting the students back into the classroom so they can get back to the learning as well, but we've gone the reverse. So we have to really look at the policies that are undergirding the school discipline, inside of the school, okay? And then as we look at this, there's another notion that goes on, even when the students are in the classroom or in the school, whatever the situation is. For oftentimes for Black students, there's always a charity approach to Black students. Oh, well, they have a home situation that is kind of unique, oh, well, maybe they don't have a parent at home or, whatever the woe is me excuse that they give to the students. So it's more of a charity approach. So one thing is, all Black students are not poor. All Black students, they don't live in single family household. So as we start to look at this, the charity approach that is going on in schools are crippling Black students in such a way that the expectation for them inside of the school has been lowered so much that everybody, all the students know it's happening, and then what it does in their mind, it plays out where, okay, well, they don't expect much of me anyway. So, why should I even give the extra effort, as well? So to combat these things, and many other practices that are going on in the school, we really have to take a look at who we're putting, in the schools as leaders and as teachers. Because in every school, and I say this in every school that I go to, every principal knows the teachers that are not doing anything, to support Black students. Okay, they all know who they are, right? Is that teacher on that back hallway who has the most referrals? They're always calling the office, saying, "Come get this student, come get this student," and everybody knows that teacher is struggling, and they allow them to stay. Okay, and then so as we start to look at these things, these are practices that we must improve upon, inside the school. But then also looking at the referral issue, what happens for many principals is that once they get all these referrals, and every principal knows who writes the most referrals or who the students are having the most problem with, one thing that we can do to change that is we have enough data in the school to know who the teachers are that are getting the best performance for Black students. And the role of the leadership is to assign the students to classrooms where they have the best situation to succeed. Okay, so oftentimes what we see, and this is kind of, I call it one of the dirty little secrets of education when it's time for a new school year to come forward. Usually most veteran teachers kind of lobby the principal to get what they perceive as the best students, and they kind of cherry pick who they want in their rooms, and then usually leaves the Black students with the most, inexperienced teachers, who never had an opportunity to work with them before as well. So if we want to bring solution to the table, what we have to do for school leaders that are in the building is to utilize the data and say, this teacher is, these sets of teachers are getting high performance from Black students, and despite their, background that they bring to the classroom, they are getting performance for these students. And these are the types of things that in the daily practices of schools that we have to improve upon to, at least give our Black students an equal chance of success. Because if they're going into a situation where the teachers may be inexperienced, they've never taught Black students before, or if they have taught Black students, they have not gotten the performance from these students, and they are not relating to these students. And then now we're asking students to oftentimes do the miracle in the classroom for the shortcoming of the educator. And those are some things that we have to consider, inside of the classroom, because I'll close this point on this, is that anytime a referral comes, the question that the school leader needs to ask, is this situation because of the student or the shortcoming of the educator? Because oftentimes we believe the educator is always right, which in many cases, because I see it all the time when I'm in the classrooms in schools across the country, it's more of the educator's shortcoming than the student's shortcoming as well.
It's in some ways almost marvelous, and I don't mean marvelous in a good way. I just mean it in simply that it's marvelous how you can have two children in the same classroom, same social environment, same students, same teacher, and two wildly different experiences in the same setting.
Same setting. And oftentimes, this is what I'm talking about, where leaders have to identify those teachers who have shown success, okay? Because if not, you're going to have this wild disparity between the student. And here's a little insight on mindset as it goes to Black students in schools. So when a principal receives a referral, usually their mindset is, how can I address the situation and get the student back to class, okay? But when a teacher writes a referral, it's kind of like a life sentence. Like, I'll write you up, you need to go, and you need to be gone as long as possible. And even when the administrator brings the kid back, they're mad now at the administrator because the administrator brought the kid back, okay? And so these are things that students will pick up on the teacher doesn't want me in here, okay? And so then they'll lead to phrases that Black students will say like, the teacher doesn't like me, okay? And then so that's because they know that teacher does not want them back in the classroom. And like I said earlier, the referral could have been because of the shortcoming of the educator, not a particular student as well. And now the teacher doesn't want them back in the classroom. Now the student has to learn under that situation.
So what happens if you're the parent of that student who says the teacher doesn't like me?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do? Do you just keep pressing forward, try to talk to the teacher, leave the child in the environment?
Right.
How do you do
Great question. And in answering that question, usually the situation that I just explained, the majority of that conversation would never even make it to the parent. So the parent wouldn't even know, okay? Only thing the parent would hear is that the student got put out of class because they were acting up, okay? And now, from that particular standpoint, we need to have a conversation with you before we bring the kid back. Okay, so nothing is talked about with the shortcoming of the educator, okay? But if we put that on the side, okay, leave that there. If we think about, okay, now what's the role of the parent, okay? Is that now a parent is now entering the building, okay? And they have to interact with the front office staff, okay? Who may not be the nicest people in the world in some situations, okay? And then also a parent who may have had a negative experience with school themselves, okay? And then so now we're asking that parent to do something to navigate a water that they haven't done before. But here's one thing that white parents have done well, which not advocating that we have to do the same thing, but they've learned how to leverage the system in their favor, okay? Is that what they have done is that they have pressured the principals and school leaders to put their students in classrooms with teachers that give them the best advantage for success, okay? So here's what I mean, okay? So let's just say, our student, our Black student, for this example, is a student that is expressive, an extrovert, okay? And a teacher perceives that as, sometimes as a discipline issue because they like to talk a lot, okay? And this teacher likes it quiet in their room. So then in this situation, parent advocates for a classroom change for the student to a teacher that has a more engaging teaching style that embraces students, to voice and, use all of their talents that they bring to the table, which then leads to a more pleasurable experience for the student. And now the student goes from the teacher doesn't like me to I love that teacher because now I can be, who I am. And so that role of the parent then is to press the school leadership on making sure the student-teacher match is the best situation for the student as well.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
I've definitely seen it where when parents push that schools will, when there are good administrators and good teachers with good hearts, that they will be responsive.
Yes.
You find yourself pushing and a school is not responding in that type of way, it's probably says something about the overall environment of that institution.
Exactly. Yeah. So they've already set up a culture in that building where this kind of behavior by the teachers is allowed.
Yeah.
And that unfortunately puts Black families in a situation that is uncomfortable for them because they don't get all of the information from the school, right? So all they know is you just need to have a conversation or a parent conference with the teacher, and or the principal and, other key educators in the building without knowing that that teacher has maybe created an environment that is just not beneficial for that student. But it's now looked at as it's the fault of the student. Yeah, so I was just saying that oftentimes, these parents, are advised to have a parent-teacher conference with the teacher, but unfortunately, in many cases, that teacher has already set an environment that is just unproductive for the student. And many times when these teachers that we're referring to go into a parent-teacher conference, not only do they negatively judge the student, they also negatively judge their parent as well, and unfortunately, most schools say they want parent involvement, but really what they mean is that they just want a parent to come, drag their Black kid out when they see that they are having the issues versus truly being involved. But oftentimes, in my experience, many schools are not making the spaces for parents to be involved, in the classroom, as well. So it puts the parent in a, kind of hard situation as well. But this is why for parents of Black children, meeting as many educators in that building, as possible outside of the teacher is important as well, because these other people in the building can help you navigate the situation as well.
Are any parting thoughts or words that you want to leave folks with as they think about this linkage between Black lives and Black minds?
Yeah, so when we think about this, the first thing that we have to understand, and I'll just use myself as an example. I'm a graduate of a high school in Louisiana, where I'm from, where everybody on the outside would consider it the one of the worst schools in the city where I grew up, right? And but inside of that school, we had educators who truly cared about us and made sure our success was a priority. And as we look at this parallel between Black Lives Matter, and Black Minds Matter, what we have to understand is that, these students that are in our schools are just like anybody else in the country. They want to be heard, they want to be understood and appreciated inside of the school building, okay? Because the funny thing about students is that when they know you truly care about them, they will go with you as far as you can take them, okay? But they are going to assess, and they're going to assess quickly whether or not you truly care about them. And when they know you don't, they're going to remind you of that on a daily basis.
And you should know that they are better at spotting a phony than anybody else.
Anybody else. And I tell teachers, especially at the beginning of the school year, I say, look, you have about 2 minutes, right, to set the stage, because if they don't perceive that you care about them and have their best interests at heart, you have to have it on the first day, because if you don't, you've already lost the school year. Okay. And so in them spotting that, you can draw the parallel to the Black Lives Matter movement. People now are protesting these same kind of organizations who don't have their best interests at heart. Okay. And so these trains are running parallel to each other as well. So let me give you another parallel that's running. Okay. Let's talk about academic success and what it leads to. So for academic success to happen inside of the school, a couple of variables have to be at play, okay? One, you have to care about me first, okay? Two, you have to be able to teach me in a way where I can see my everyday reality inside of the course content, okay? If we take that same parallel into what's happening with Black Lives Matter, is that when I look at my everyday reality, whether it's a government organization, company, corporation, if you don't value my everyday reality and help me move to a next level situation, then we have a problem on our hands as well. Because this is why you see people calling people out now, and saying, hey, we're not taking this any longer, because if I'm going to either invest my time in this school or invest my time in this job or this college or university, we need to know before we even go further, do you value what I bring to the table? Okay. Yeah, and the third parallel I would like to close with is that leadership matters. Okay, and so inside of the school, you're now seeing movements inside of the schools where students are doing, their form of protesting inside of, schools and colleges and universities, because when you look at the leadership in those particular organizations, they are so distant away from what the true needs are of these particular stakeholders, Black students, Black teachers, whatever it is in that situation, that now, this population is saying, okay, it's time for us to be heard. Okay. And if they're not going to hear us, we're going to force them to hear us. And this is the same thing that you're seeing in the Black Lives Matter movement, where leadership has been so distant from the true needs of these stakeholders. Now, when the protests emerge, now is how do we do catch up real quick? And their catch up would be, okay, let's just write a statement and that should calm everybody down. Okay. And we see how that's working. That's not working at all. Okay. Because they are now saying, here are our set of demands. Okay. And if you don't meet these, it's going to be a problem. And so as we start to look at the parallels between Black Lives Matter and Black Minds Matter, one thing that will be important in moving forward is the answer to one key question. And that question is, do we value this population enough to truly integrate them into all facets of the organization? And until we get to that point, then we will continue to see more and more protests demanding for not only a seat at the table, but a voice at the table, but then also decision-making authority at the table as well. And this is how I see the parallels running together as well.
And that's a really good point. Not just a seat at the table, but decision-making authority at the table.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're just a guest in someone else's house.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Eating crumbs as well. So,
well, again, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your wisdom. So we are grateful that we were able to bring you back and for you to similarly shed light on new things for everybody. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And, as I mentioned, I'm very proud of this movement and how it has grown exponentially. So I want you all to keep up the great work that you're doing as well. And I'll love any time that you would have me. I'd love to be back as well.
So everyone, we are very fortunate to have with us Andre Perry, who is an incredible scholar and a thought leader as it comes to serving our Black students in education. Again, thank you for being here, Dr. Perry.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, of course. I talk a lot about education, but what I'm going to present to you today may seem like it falls outside of education, but remember, kids don't live in schools, they live in communities. Yeah. And we have got to look at all of the intersections of inequality that impact students and their communities and schools. So that's what I'm going to present today. I'm going to share a screen with you that will that has a presentation, and it's called Worthy of Investment, the Devaluation of Assets in Black Communities. A lot of my ideas you can find in my new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, just released in May, and it's getting a lot of traction. So go out, get your copy, get it for your classes. I guarantee you it's an incredible read, but I'm going to just essentially narrate one of the anchors of the book that you'll find. I study Black majority cities across the United States. And for those who do not know, there are about 1,200 Black majority cities concentrated in the South. But as you can see, they move all around, across the Eastern Seaboard up to the Midwest. There are a few in California, but I examined the economic and social conditions in all those cities, including education. My story starts here at home. This is where I was raised, 1320 Hill Avenue in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. It's a small Black majority municipality, about 17,000 people are in it. That's my home. It's boarded up. The roof is bowing, and it is currently owned by the municipality of Wilkinsburg. A bank will not back a mortgage for this home because it's priced well below the amount someone would provide a mortgage to. So if someone wanted to pick up the taxes, they could own that home. And every time I go to Pittsburgh, I go to that home because it's astounding why essentially it's not worth much, given what has happened in that home and in that area for decades before. As the story was told to me, the older woman in the upper right-hand corner, her name is Elsie Boyd. I call her Mom. When I was born, there was a deal made between Mom and my maternal grandmother for her to take me in to raise me. And I stayed. I went to the home. My older brother came with me after I was born, and we were reared there. Along the way, when I was there, she watched raise more than about 12 to 15 kids for varying durations. You know, my brothers and me were informally adopted, and so we stayed until graduating from high school. But some people would stay for months, some for a few years. But she reared a lot of kids, saved our lives. And it wasn't until I got to college did I realize by reading the Moynihan Report that people thought that she was putting us in harm's way, that my biological mother, by making a deal, but being a single parent, so to speak, and then giving me up in this informal / formal, I'll get to that later, structure, put me in harm's way. But I say all the time when I read that, I said that couldn't be true because the family that raised me did so out of necessity. Pittsburgh at the time was undergoing a significant economic crisis. U.S. Steel was about to pull out. Unemployment was at a record high. The unemployment in Allegheny County was about 20%, which means Black unemployment was probably like at 40%. And since historically the unemployment rate is double for Black people, and we know that when white people catch a cold, Black people catch pneumonia, COVID, whatever you want to say. But another reason why my mother reared me is because my father, who is pictured here, with afro. You're going to appreciate that afro, I'm sure. But
I love that afro.
My father here is pictured. He was a heroin addict, and he was in and out of prison. He actually died in prison. He died to a single stab wound to the heart a day before his 28th birthday. The story was told to me that he died breaking up a fight. That's somewhat hard to believe because in the nature in which he was killed, he died early in the morning, single stab wound, probably someone got him in his sleep. But the point of the matter is that he died, he was killed in prison. And a lot of my story, what I'm about to tell you, we'll get to this point of we need to change the narrative of the conditions of Black cities, the conditions of Black people, and so that we fully examine the resources that are extracted from communities that often lead to my father and others ending up in a negative circumstance. So I started a lot of this research looking at homes because one, there's a lot of data around homes, and you can really get to what I call devaluation, the purposeful suppression of prices in this case that leads to an extraction of wealth in Black communities. Here on this chart, you'll see that on the x-axis, the percent of Blacks in a metropolitan area. And on the y-axis, you'll see the home prices of the homes within that area. So in areas where the Black population is less than 1%, home prices are about $340,000 compared to places where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher, and you see that home prices are about half as much, about $184,000. Now, a lot of people will say, I'll go back to this, a lot of people say, well, that's because of education, that's because of crime, and other behaviors of the residents in them. Well, that's something you can control for in a study, and that's exactly what we did. We looked at that absolute price difference, what we showed you in that chart earlier, but we controlled for the structural characteristics of the home. We controlled for the number of rooms, the size, the Zillow data gave us a sense of quality by square foot. In addition, we control for neighborhood amenities, things like crime, education, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics you see, number of restaurants, all of those things. And what we found astounds that after you control for those variables, home prices in Black neighborhoods are priced 48% lower than their equivalent homes in white neighborhoods under equivalent situations, social circumstances. That's about a 23% difference. Accumulatively, that's about 156 billion in lost equity. Now, you see devaluation all across the country in metro areas. Wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where housing devaluation occurs. Wherever you see a green circle, that's where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher on average than their white counterparts. Now, clearly there are some places where that occurred, but the overall overarching trend is that homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued. Here, just one example, Little Rock, just random 13% difference, $11,000 difference. Now, but they're more severe in other places. Lynchburg, for instance, 81% difference. Rochester, New York, 65% difference. Jacksonville, Florida, 47% difference. Again, there are places where homes are appreciating in value higher than their white counterparts. Boston, for instance, 23%. But by no means is Lynchburg any more racist than Boston, I would argue. But there are some differences in home prices. But I'm going to put this in perspective. 156 billion, what does that mean, really? It would have funded, 156 billion would have funded 4.4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount Blacks use to start up their firms. It would have paid for about 8 million four-year degrees based on the average cost of a public four-year degree. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan nearly 3,000 times over. It would have covered all of nearly 97% of damage of Hurricane Katrina. And it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. Remember, I said my father who died of a heroin overdose. And this leads me to sort of the core of my talk. There's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That there's this white supremacist myth that says the conditions of Black cities, Black neighborhoods, Black schools are a direct result of the people in them. What my data shows, yes, crime helps reduce the price of a home. Education quality certainly reduce the price of the home. But when people look at Black cities, it's almost like they're saying or Black communities, it's almost like they're saying there's twice as much crime than there actually is. That education is twice as bad than it actually is. And that money, as I indicated, is extracted without any action taking place. And remember, the reason why I showed the consequences is that extraction is real wealth, real money that often predicts for academic achievement. But we're constantly blaming Black people, Black teachers, Black school leaders, Black districts for the failures, the quote unquote failures of public education. But really, we should be looking at the structures that cause inequality. That's where the failure lies, not in the people. And so, we treat Black schools, Black students, or Black schools and Black school districts like we treat Black people. We will jail them, take them over, we'll do all these nefarious things to quote unquote, to close the achievement gap. Instead of addressing the structural problems that are that's throttling Black social and economic mobility. I'm going to stop there. But a lot of people know me more from education, but it was my experiences in New Orleans that led me down this path. Yeah. Because so much of the reforms that happened in New Orleans was about blaming Black people, Black teachers, Black students. You know, the loss of Black teachers were significant over the course of after 10 years after the reforms in New Orleans. It went from having about 70% of Black teachers in the city to about 50%. The number of students who were suspended and expelled, we can not go back and count that. The denial of special needs, special ed services to students by various providers, well documented. But the point is, the same way did we devalue homes in Black communities, the same way did we devalue educational services. You know, when people say public education, there's been such a negative campaign against public schools that people say failing schools. But schools, one, don't fail anything. They're not they're an inanimate object. The people who are constantly leveling anti-Black policies against Black communities, school boards, students, universities, that's what's wrong. Yeah. And so we've got to redirect our efforts to addressing that anti-Black policy, or we're always going to be reforming at the fringes and blaming Black people in the process. So again, there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. It's on the t-shirt, which you could get from Bailiwick Clothing, by the way, in Washington, D.C. But it's a theme that quote is stated throughout my book, Know Your Price. And I show how in housing, education, economic development, reproductive justice, all of these things, there are sources of inequality that generates negative outcomes. And we've got to work on those structures instead of blaming Black people.
Wow, that's powerful. And that chart is really astounding. To think, for example, that Lynchburg, Virginia, and Rochester would have that much of a difference in comparison is shocking.
Well, it is, but when you think about how redlining in the 30s throughout the 70s took place, folks who don't know, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was backed by the federal government, they deemed majority Black cities too risky to let out home loans, refinancing loans, which essentially said that we wouldn't be able to invest in our communities. The damage was severe. Right now, the racial wealth gap is, the black-white racial wealth gap is 170,000 median white wealth compared to about 17,000 for Black families. So 10 times the difference. And a lot of that was not caused, but clearly not caused by hard work and determination and ability to save. It came about because white families were invested in the 30s. They were able to buy homes, purchase homes, start communities. They were able to pass that equity down to their children. Their children were able to use it for college, to start businesses. That wealth begat more wealth. Blacks have always been denied those opportunities to gain wealth. And even in our school reforms, and where I'm in New Orleans, we're constantly investing in white people to fix Black people. And again, when I show in my book how the Black middle class was essentially gutted by many of our reforms, that's a form of wealth extraction. And we know in education, some of the number one predictors of academic success revolve around wealth, income, parental educational status. So all these things that should empower Black families to achieve have been extracted by policy. I mean, again, and I want to say, we need to look for the policies as the problem and fix those and stop blaming Black people in the process.
So one of the things that when I see those differences is to think about how schools are funded. Because as you know, some schools are going to be funded based upon local bonds. They're going to be based upon property values. So how does that pattern that you see now influence? Because you do work in multiple fields. How do you see that now connecting to education?
Yeah, I mean, right. You and I should have mentioned this, but a lot of that money should be going to school boards and municipalities. You know, the money that is generated through property taxes is largely based on home values. Yeah. And so it's not surprising when you learn that schools predominated by students of color get $23 billion less in funding than majority white schools. $23 billion. So when my charter colleagues used to say money doesn't matter, I would love to switch places where you're getting $23 billion more in funding. But that's directly tied to our over time, the historic effort of white families to choose not to receive an education with Black people. That we've gerrymandered districts. We've that essentially accentuated the pattern caused by redlining of saying, hey, they're the problem. We don't want to get an education with Black people. They're going to drain resources. It's almost as if many white families believe, and middle class families believe poverty is some kind of disease that's going to rub off on you, and somehow you're going to catch the Black poor disease. But this pattern of that redlining sort of, one of the things that it established was the purposeful throttling of Black wealth and assets, but it also just set a horrible trend of saying Black people are too risky to invest in, that they need to be fixed in order, they need to look more middle class like us, without giving them the middle class money, by the way, but we're going to fix them. And so it's related to schools in so many different ways in that regard. The criminal justice system is, I can't think of another wealth extractor that is as big as the criminal justice system. You are literally arresting economic mobility. When a Derek Chauvin can casually put his knee in the back of a neck of a Derek Floyd, it's a statement that Black people don't belong in the economy. Remember, police are protecting and serving a public. But the disproportionate nature of these negative outcomes suggests we're not considered part of the public. We're considered threats to the public. And so I'm saying this in a very economic lens. We're not getting any return on investment, on our tax dollar investments in criminal justice systems policing. And so we should be investing in things that excite economic mobility. So when you hire a Black teacher, guess what you're doing? You're not only hiring someone who's in the middle class, that person's also amplifying somebody into the middle class. Like again, you and Donna know this, that Black and brown teachers add educational value to students' lives, better academic outcomes, better disciplinary outcomes. There's a lot of added value there. And so every time we don't hire a Black person, we're losing opportunities to develop community wealth. And so our reforms have to be pointed in a direction where we're adding jobs, adding quality, reducing discipline problems, removing structural barriers, settling for just moving the furniture around within a broken house is not reform. You eventually need to get at the structures that cause the inequality, and that's hard work. I'm the first to say, when we're talking about changing funding formulas in a way that removes the power of property taxes on districts and saying we need to distribute those funds equitably, you're going to have a fight on your hands. But for those who really are passionate about education, you don't want to work within the confines of inequality, because again, the only place you have left is to do with blame Black people. And that doesn't work. So it's better just to work on the structures that we know are harmful to Black children, families, communities.
So what can people do about those structures? Like, I know that there's probably a lot of people who are hearing this and thinking to themselves, well, those sound like some big problems. What is my space in that? What can I be doing? So what can people do to help address these issues? So maybe what are the bigger issues that you think they should be addressing, and then how should they go about addressing them?
Well, I'm going to give you some concrete ones around housing and around education, but theoretically, this is about identifying the impediments that remove wealth and jobs from any kind of community, and inserting ones, reforms and changes that add value. One of the things I'm very passionate about, we need to figure out ways to have low-income renters become homeowners, particularly in areas. Now, this is not as true on the West Coast, where property is so high and the housing stock, there's limited opportunities. But if you go to Detroit, for instance, there are thousands of properties priced under $30,000 that a person should be able, with a minimum wage job, should be able to get into a home. No, like my home in Wilkinsburg, right? We should find ways to finance that. So I'm working with congressional leaders on establishing new loan products that will enable low-income people who did not have the wealth, or that wealth was not passed down to them. So if your mother or father did not own a home, you should be eligible for this program, and in which you can purchase, get a loan that typically a bank won't back, and purchase homes. In addition, I do believe in providing current homeowners with microloans so that they can fix up their property, have discretionary income, because That's what's missing when home values drop. You just have less discretionary income to put towards education, all those different things. On the education front, I talk about this all the time. For me, it's plain and simple: hire more Black people, and invest in institutions that have a track record of graduating Black and brown teachers. Everybody knows, and you hear this all the time, HBCUs. There's like a lot of Columbusing of HBCUs nowadays. They finally discovered the power of HBCUs. And that's important. We should be investing more in HBCUs. And as we know, they certainly don't get the kind of federal grants as their PWI counterparts. So there's certainly supporting HBCUs, but we also, as a necessity, just because of numbers, we need to incentivize institutions that are actually have good outcomes with Black and brown students. And so when we're talking about creating federal programs to increase the number of teachers in community, we should have a racial equity lens in distributing those funds. If you are very good at graduating Black and brown teachers, then you should receive funding for that, because that's what the problem is. We do not have a problem recruiting another white female elementary school teacher. I mean, we have an abundance of that. That's not the issue. We need diversity, and that's not a knock on our colleagues, but we've got to incentivize inclusion in ways that are deliberate. And so those are some of the things I talk a lot about in the book, how to invest in ways to increase the number of Black teachers. But it's a reform we have yet to try at scale. We talk about it, but we really have not institutionalized it in terms of policy.
And do you think that's because of a lack of desire, or lack of ideas? What is it? Or is it structural discrimination?
No, I really think it's because we devalue Black women. Just teachers is predominantly women in general. But when you're looking at Black women who are in other areas in particular where there's not any kind of union, Black women are paid significantly less, have less benefits, all those different things. So we really have to invest in Black women in a very strong way. And I know there's a lot of efforts to increase the percentage of Black male teachers, and we must do that. But the lion's share of Black educators are women. And if you really want to change it and add value to community, you have to invest in them. There's no way around it.
No, that's a great point. Very, very good point. So I have to say, when you were talking about your background, I didn't realize that there were so many parallels. So like you, I was adopted. I was a twin brother, born ward of the court. Mother was in prison. We went straight into the foster care system. We ended up being adopted, grew up in a home where there was tons of people coming in and out throughout our lives. So I have a large family. And then when you were talking about your father passing away in prison, my dad also passed away in prison. So when I was hearing you talk about your story, it made me realize, like, wow, I have long thought of my story as being aberrant, but maybe it's not so much. Maybe it is a common story.
Yeah, I dedicated my book to the children of incarcerated parents, and the reason why, and I said something to the effect, it's not your fault, because we carry a burden that a lot of folks don't realize how many people have been in our situation. And I don't know about you, I think you said this, I didn't really talk about my family story at all. I mean, I just didn't. In fact, in Pittsburgh, it was kind of shunned upon to give people a quote unquote excuse. And so you just didn't talk about those things. You just moved along. But the reality is that these kind of happenings are systemic. I meet so many people like yourself we have similar stories. And that's why, going back to the Moynihan report, we're constantly demonized for various family constructions in Black America. But when you look at the systemic violence on Black families, these are adaptive strategies to our condition. Family construction is based on your social environment. And so there was nothing wrong with my family, but there was a whole lot wrong with how my family was considered in policy. And who knows where my father would be if he wasn't criminalized. We have a lot of successful people who have persisted in spite of conditions. But we have a whole lot of people who didn't make it. Yeah. And I say that we need to end this sort of exceptional Negro narrative. I mean, there's a whole lot of people who are much more deserving than me to be in the position I'm in. A lot of folks who are smarter, harder working, and a fall became something, tragic. And so for me, I never lose sight that there are many of us that have similar experiences with incarceration, with wealth extraction. But we didn't cause that. But we do have an obligation to help change it, for sure.
Well, we greatly appreciate your time. Is there any words you'd like to leave those who are watching this with?
Well, I will. I wanted to share how my book became the title, where it came from. It's called Know Your Price, but it's based off of a refrain in my favorite play in the whole wide world, Two Trains Running. In the play, the main character, Memphis, is about to have his property seized by the city of Pittsburgh through eminent domain. The city of Pittsburgh offers him $15,000. And Memphis says, no, I'm not selling my property for $15,000. I know my price. I got my price. And it's a refrain throughout the play. There's another character, Hambone, who paints a fence for a ham. He paints a fence, never gets his ham. And throughout the play, he says, give me my ham, give me my ham, give me my ham, until he goes crazy and dies. But there's actually a happy ending to this story. I know, because people are like, wow, that's pretty sad. But
yeah, I was about to say.
But the happy story, part of the story, is that the main character, Memphis, after battling with the city, gets $35,000, and it's assumed that he's getting the market rate or the white rate. And the moral of the story is, no, you have to have worth, know your worth. But what I try to do is give people the price to stand on, even if it means going crazy and dying. That when you know your value, there's nothing you won't do to achieve justice. And I'm hoping this book will give folks this sense of their value and their price to stand on.
Well, I think those are wonderful closing words. I hope everyone will go out and get a copy of it. Know Your Price. You can see the picture of it, an image of it in the back there, and we'll make sure to send it out with everyone as well as part of the information that we're sharing. So thank you, Brother Perry, for the incredible work that you're doing, for your dedication to our community, for the advocacy that you've been engaged in. We're grateful to call you our own.
Oh, and it's good to be a part of this community. Great to be a part. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, everyone. That was a wonderful set of interviews for today. We look forward to seeing you this Sunday for our live office hours And for our final week, which is next week, we have some really incredible special guests and some surprises that we haven't even announced. So come back, be back. We'll see you next time. And just remember that Black minds matter.